Herzlich willkommen to our Subnet talk. We're going to be talking about the Dork Enlightenment. And Paul Feigelfeld will give us an insight into methods of how to deal with this new phenomenon. Paul has a background in cultural studies and computer science, and is a professor at the Mozarteum. And take it away, my dear. Please.
Thank you for this very precise and concise introduction. And thanks for having me. Today I want to talk about something that's been bugging me a lot for a long time, but recently especially, which is fascism, a problem that we are all familiar with. And given my background in media theory, media history, and computer science, I've been thinking about the sort of the ideologies and the political implications, but also the political prehistories and then the political effects of technologies, especially recently, of course, machine learning and things like this. So I wasn't really sure how to exactly maneuver it today. So I'm gonna start with just a little insight into how else we could actually read and write the histories of our technologies. And then maybe talk about, well, really the theoretical underpinnings of what's going on at the moment, what we see happening in politics and in societies and in sort of the destruction of democratic systems. So, you all might remember this incident. Can someone tell me what it was? No, Deep Blue was a lot earlier. Yeah, so this was the infamous AlphaGo match, the second one actually. The first one was against Lee Sedol, this was against Kijie, Chinese Go grandmaster. This was in 2016, and Go until then was regarded as sort of the pinnacle of human intellect. It was very popular in computer science and mathematics, and also a game that was considered to be unbreakable, unbeatable, unplayable by machines on a level comparable to that of a human, because people thought that Go would require something like actual intelligence or intuition, something deeply human, something that couldn't be just computed by brute force. So, as you know, in the 1990s, Deep Blue defeated Garry Kasparov, which was a big feat in itself, but as it turns out, of course, Go is very, chess is very complex, but well, you can break it with brute force. If you have a computer that's fast enough, it would just do it. Not so much with Go, people thought. Then again, and this was like a culture shock. People actually thought, well, the singularity is here. Especially in Asian countries and like Korea and Japan and China, it was like billions of dollars were poured into funding AI projects, but also they were like people got shit-faced and thought that it was the end of the world. It's like mass drinking orgies and stuff like this happened. Really fun newspaper reports about that. Of course, it turns out it wasn't that complicated after all. Still, it's also mathematics, and it's breakable. And it was just a very, very complex neural network. As you know, afterwards, AlphaGo got beat by AlphaGo 0, which was the next iteration, which in the biblical time of 7 days, I think, learned to become sort of self-aware and realize what a game is and how to play Go, and that the objective is to win, and then pretty much learned every game imaginable and beat everyone. This is a prehistory that also goes back to China, but first it goes to the University of California in Berkeley, and to a letter from 1949 addressed to Professor Norbert Wiener, who might be familiar to most of you, I think. Anyone know who Norbert Wiener was? So the founder of cybernetics, cybernetics being the science of communication and control that was established by this guy Norbert Wiener in the between the 1930s and the late 1940s when the book was published, and then became sort of a universal way of thinking about the world in terms of regarding the world as a collection of feedback systems that could also, of course, be designed like a machine. And I would argue that we still live in the world of cybernetics. So the world that these people imagined, it was followed by a series of conferences called the Macy conferences, where pretty much everyone who was someone in the world of science and technology and psychology and behaviorism and ethnology came together and literally imagined the 21st century. So the guy who wrote this letter is the only Chinese person in the room. His name is Chao Yan-ren. And he wrote this letter in 1949, and we owe it to him that computer scientists started playing Go, because he said, "Dear Norbert Wiener, you can read it yourself. Have you ever thought about using your computer to play Go? It could be really interesting." And now, you know, look at us. Norbert Chao Yan-ren is a really interesting figure. I wrote a lot about him in my PhD because he did something quite. He was a linguist, mostly an interpreter and also a translator. And he did was what people thought would be completely impossible. He translated this book. You recognize it, I guess. It's Alice in Wonderland, into Chinese in 1922. Why is that interesting? So in 1922, the Chinese language is still pretty much the same, in the same state it was like in 1642. So there wasn't much language reform. You had a very, very convoluted, antiquated writing system. These are classical Chinese characters. And a very heavy sort of literal and literary language that was being used. And also it was considered to be unsuitable for any kind of sort of logical argumentation or stuff like this, which was why sort of the British intelligence sort of hijacked the Chinese intelligence system in a way. So what he showed by doing this translation is, because as you know, Lewis Carroll's name actually is Charles Dodgson, and he was by training and by profession a teacher of logic, is full of logic puzzles and little riddles and rhymes, and is considered very hard to translate, because if you really want to do the text honor, you really have to try to translate all the different layerings of it, the rhymes, the logics, everything in there. And so by translating it, he demonstrated not only that he was a very great translator, but he demonstrated that it was possible to do so in Chinese. So he was also part of a movement that started to reform the Chinese language, which was very important between World War I and World War II, and then in the end was finished up by Mao after the World War. So what we can see here, of course, is a process of optimization, of having a very large, very interesting but ancient system of complexities like languages have, and the way how we can actually treat it and make it simpler. I would argue this is a different part of my research. I wrote my PhD about this, the influence of Chinese thinking and Chinese thinkers on the development of artificial intelligence starting in the 16th century. So, but I'll talk to you about that another time if you want. So what I want to introduce is a term that usually people are not familiar with. I suspect some here in this room might be familiar with it. This term. So anyone heard of it? What could it be? Except the state of the Go player in the picture. And of course what Chao Yan-ren did with the Chinese language.
Is it the best way of how you can get brain damage?
Yeah, if you try hard enough. It is kind of, it's funny because this is a term that I came across it when I was studying artificial intelligence in, I think, 2005 or something like this. So back in the winter of AI, when all you learned in AI training in computer science was how to play soccer with robot dogs. And it is actually a technical term introduced in a paper in 1989 called optimal brain damage, which is very simply put a way of reducing the complexities of complex neural networks if they become too heavy. So the same thing that we saw with the Chinese language is now a paradigm, you could say, in terms of how we address the question of intelligence. And I want you to keep that in mind because it is something that I think is important to consider when we think about the role that artificial intelligence has in the way that it is used to reformulate and redesign today's societies and our world and the way that we think about the world. One of the guys who wrote this paper, you can see in this video. This is, I think, from 1994. And these numbers have by now become iconic. Like the way that they are written. So this is in a lab, I think, somewhere in France at the CNRS. And these are very early examples of OCR, basically. So character recognition, but also handwriting. And I find it always good to point out that even though we have this vast machine of planetary computation and secret government labs, it's sometimes really just guys like these or here who built these things. So the guy's name is Yann Lequin, this guy, and he's I think by now is a 3 or 4 time Turing Award winner, basically the Alan Turing of Alan Turings. So he is also the head of Meta's artificial intelligence program. It was originally called FAIR, Facebook Artificial Intelligence Research, which I find a bit ironic. So we have this arch starting basically in the 1920s in China. This is just, I'm doing like really big steps. And going through Norbert Wiener and cybernetics and some French dude in the 1980s to where we are today, where optimal brain damage is used to reduce a society and its political infrastructure to rubble. So if we think about what's happening today, and this is something that I will argue that it's not only happening in the US, but what we see in the US is a certain case at the moment. We see the same thing with a slightly different style happening in other countries in the world, and it's also happening in Austria, also at least some people try to do that. This is, of course, something that has been in its ideological coloring going on for a long time, you could say. So we find the same idea that technology is good for us in terms of it can solve our problems, it can simplify things, it will do away with human error. We find it in Adam Smith, we find it in Karl Marx, we find it in blockchain technology, we find it in the whole idea of technological solutionism. But of course, if you apply it to democracy and to the state apparatus, it is the eradication of participation or the possibility of participation and of human discourse and democratic exchange. So it's really a problem that we are witnessing there at the moment. I highly recommend this article by Eric Salvaggio that describes this AI coup, as he calls it, quite well. So let's go back to the time after World War II. Because, as you know, so we had cybernetics, we had these conferences where people came together and thought that, hey, maybe, machines could be used to govern societies. This also, I would always think that this is because after something like a cataclysmic event or 2 cataclysmic events, like 2 world wars, and the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you will, if you look back in history, always find humans trying to build sort of synthetic systems afterwards, something that will, you know, rebuild society and civilization together. And this is something you can really see happening in cybernetics. So the idea that technology and nature can become one, that humans work together with machines, that everyone sort of understands each other, is something that gets immediately picked up by the American counterculture movement. So the hippie movement and everyone like that, these are the first people who actually try to implement cybernetic ideas. There are lots of, like the communes that you will find in the US, but also elsewhere in the world. But what you also find are sort of the, I don't know, ideological tricksters that come with it. So in the 1960s, this book is published for the first time, De Principia Discordia. The first 5 issues are printed on, I forgot his name. Have you seen the movie JFK? So the district attorney, the guy who's a real person who came up with the whole conspiracy theory about JFK being assassinated by the CIA, this was printed on his printer. And the idea in this book, which became a hit with the counterculture and also later on with hacker culture, was that basically there is no order in nature. There is only chaos, and reality is chaos. And the only people who, the only reason we have order is because we project it onto chaos. So we build order. Pretty much the same idea that it's being used if you do deep learning, you know? So you have a chaotic, noisy system, and you say, well, I project a certain form of order on it, I amplify it, and I go with that. So this gets picked up, this whole idea, by counterculture. Also the idea, this is the moment that mass media starts to emerge, that manipulation is possible, that information is something that is sort of free-floating and can be used and designed in whatever which way you like, and that chaos can also be used as a very powerful political tool. Counterculture plays a huge role in the development of AI, but also, I mean, as you know, in the development of computing in general. So the whole hippie movement in Silicon Valley are very, very strongly entangled. There's a fantastic book I can recommend by Fred Turner called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which traces these movements. And then you have this sort of, you know, DIY movement sparked by the Whole Earth Catalog. You are familiar with the Whole Earth Catalog? It was published by a very interesting person named Stuart Brand, who was also a witness and collaborator of the Sutherland first demo, where this would be, I think, for HCI people, very sort of historically important point. He filmed it, you know, and he became a publisher. He also started the Edge network later, and this is pretty much sort of a DIY thing that you would find on the internet today. So this is about building your own communications networks and homesteading and building communes. So this is really sort of how to create a new society. And of course, it used the first image. I think this is another edition. It's the last Whole Earth Catalog, but the first one used the blue marble image. So this all happens in the 60s. You have this idea that individualism arises, that communes become something quite interesting, that networking becomes quite important at some point, and that we are the ones making order, not the other way around. In the early 1970s, this guy turns up. His name is Richard Dawkins. And he writes a book called The Selfish Gene, which is about evolutionary genetics and biology, and he invents the term meme, which is something that is sort of a genetic form of information, something that can evolve, that can procreate in a certain way, and then that can also mutate and then can be designed, which then again is picked up, as you know, and until he becomes a meme and we talk about him. So what we find here in the 1960s and 1970s is this idea of counterculture taking foot in the establishment. So even though, like after the protests of the 1968 generation, they slowly start to, become the professors at the universities, take over the education system. Something that, I always felt this was a good thing, but there were other people who felt the other way around. So what happens here is that the sort of underground culture breaks apart in the US. And while we have counterculture here and sort of the hippie movement, what starts to emerge in the way that in the form that we know it fit today, of course it existed earlier and it's a very sort of uniquely American thing, is the idea of libertarianism. So this is something that is very deeply rooted in American culture. It's the idea that we as Europeans and as Austrians and Germans often have a hard time, I think, understanding, which is sometimes why it's so hard to grasp what's going on in the United States, because we very much think in these categories of left and right, of course. So libertarianism is neither. It's sort of a weird spectrum where you have or like some people call it the horseshoe theory. So it's something that is so far left-wing that it's right-wing again. Or it just really eludes all of these categories. This is sort of the countercultural book catalog. I have one at home. It started in 1975. It's called the Lumpanics catalog, and it's the libertarian handbook. It's sort of the anarchist cook. It's the book catalog that sells the anarchist cookbook. So what you find in here is the same, but not, it's sort of the evil twin, whereas you have how to build a fruitful community and how to grow tomatoes. You have how to build a bomb and acid and how to, disappear people and make a fake passport on the other side. It's very entertaining. I recommend you buy one on eBay, and it's a very good read to see what books were published by them by mail order. So this is also sort of, pre-Darknet, you could say. And what happens there in the late 1970s, early 1980s, is we end up with the emergence of the alt-right movement as we know it today somehow, but we still don't really know where it comes from. So my question is, do you know this sigil? What would you just speculate where it's from? No, but like, it's not a country, I can tell you this much. It's sort of it's a movement maybe, or? So I mean, the colors are quite, telling. You might think, so we have the usual Nazi color coding, of course. We have archaic sort of mystic symbols like the black sun and stuff like this. So it looks quite heavy, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a neo-Nazi symbol, but it is the logo of the Stanford Review. So it is the logo of the first official student newspaper of Stanford University in the 1980s, founded by Peter Thiel, who, and this is the interesting point, because until quite recently I wasn't so aware of that in the 1980s, at the Ivy League schools in America, you had this counterculture. You had this movement where people were pissed off with the left-wing establishment, where they were told by the Reagan government that sort of, they should follow a certain economic regime, but at the same time, the ideologies that were being taught at the universities were democratic, were open. So there was a conflict going on, and there was a growing movement of young students who were opposing that. And Thiel saw that pretty early on and started this newspaper also as sort of, pre-internet, as a way of changing the discourse, and this worked really well. So the first issue, I think, was something like rape. Is it really wrong? You know, but not because he thought, like he was really truly interested in the question of rape, is it wrong or right, but he wanted to see, and this is textbook right-wing agitation, how far can you push the discourse? Because if you have a window of discourse and you push it to a certain direction, and you outrage people, then something that is considered really bad at the moment, if it's on the lower end of this spectrum, you can do it because people don't care anymore, because they are still outraged about you talking about rape. So this is the same thing that we can see happening over and over again today in right-wing movements. You can see it in the way that Trump makes propaganda. It is, yeah, very easy. Just change the subject, talk about something outrageous. And while people are really very much preoccupied with thinking about what an asshole you are, you can do whatever you want. So while this is happening in the US, this is happening in the UK. Anyone recognize this? I mean, this is also just a stupid meme. But what we see on the left is from the Kabbalah, and what we see on the right is an organigram of cybernetics, which has been famously used by the so-called CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at the University of Warwick in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which was sort of the nativity scene of a certain kind of very cyberpunk media theory. Really sexy, really interesting for a long time. Very, very pop-oriented, and something that influenced me very much, for example. So people who were there were, among others, Sadie Plant, who is considered the founding mother of cyberfeminism. She wrote this book, Zeros and Ones, in the 1990s, was a founding member of the CCRU. But also another person named Nick Land, who coined the term Dark Enlightenment, which we are talking about here today. What I find interesting is that in Sadie Plant we have a book here that is called Zeros and Ones, and it is the first time that someone thinks theoretically and ideologically about what it means to think in a binary pattern, and also what it means, how we could actually start to think about non-binarities, or well, a multiplicity, a diversity of zeros and ones. So a couple of years later, in 2014, Peter Thiel writes this book. It's no more zeros and ones, no more plurality, really just 0 to 1, notes on startups or how to build the future. But it's interesting, really, this tiny, tiny change in grammar that you have from zeros and ones to from 0 to 1. And as a true Leibnizian that I am, it reminded me of when Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in 1689 published his binary number system for the first time. So he had it for quite a while, but he didn't really know what to do with it. Also, Leibniz never initially thought about zeros and ones, really just two distinct symbols, and two distinct symbols are just a line and a circle. So he used that, and only later on, when he thought about, also influenced by China, by the way, publishing it, he came up with the idea, unus ex nihilo omnia, unum autem necessarium, and einer hat alles aus nichts gemacht, so 0 to 1. One has made everything from nothing. So this myth of creation is, of course, something that Peter Thiel also alludes to in a godlike fashion. Of course, this is, as we call it in academia, Antragsprosa. So it has nothing to do with the actual mechanics of binary numbers. It really is sort of just a philosophical way of expressing it. And the first time it's published, actually, by Leibniz is in a letter to a financier. So. In this book by Peter Thiel, interestingly enough, I just skipped it through. I didn't read it because it's really shitty. But we find this famous picture. You might recognize the guy on the left. So it's this iconic phantom image of the Unabomber. And he compares it to the way that Silicon Valley hipsters look at the time of the publication of the book. It's interesting to see that now in the early 2000s, when all of where we are now, how all these different lines of stories come together, because we have this accelerationist idea that's being put forth by the CCRU. So it's the idea of a technophilosophy that doesn't so much put forth an idea of a critical thinking about technology or critical analysis or a sort of a counter theory to technology, but really says, well, it's too late anyway, we might just go for it and accelerate it and drive it against the wall. So the CCRU really breaks apart. It's quite interesting to see. So Sadie Plant disappears. She stops doing media theory. Nick Land goes to China, disappears there, and starts to become a complete right-wing nutcase. And Berlin post-internet artists become obsessed with people like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. This is an artwork by an artist named Daniel Keller, who in an internet auction bought the backpack of the Unabomber and put it on show. So all of this sort of convoluted mess that we are talking about, all of these different theories come together in something that has been named the Dark Enlightenment. The Dark Enlightenment, this is just a picture I found today which has some other words in it, and supposedly some kind of a flag that I don't think they actually use. The Dark Enlightenment is the idea of the formalization of the thinking of a thinker called Curtis Yarvin, who also goes by the name of Mencius Moldbug, Mencius being Mengzi, Chinese philosopher, who started blogging about a new form of government that pretty much works like a company. So it's a mixture of a monarchy and a tech company and cameralism, with a very strongly racist and segregationist patriarchal tone. And this is sort of also, yeah, 2010, something like that. And Nick Land sort of takes all of these blog posts together and tries to sort of distill a theory from it that he calls the Dark Enlightenment. So why is this interesting for us?
It's happening.
Because it's happening, and that's the crazy part about it, is that, also this guy, that they are building it. So the whole thing that you can see that I showed you in the beginning, the sort of emptying out of democratic structures, all of this in the US is the blueprint for it, is the Dark Enlightenment. So it's been there for 20 years, the theoretical blueprint for it. We are guilty of not taking it seriously, which is easy because it's very stupid. I tried reading it, and I do that. So I read it with my students because I think it's important, but it's hard because it is really bad theory. It's not like you think, oh wow, this is really they discovered something and now they're making something great of it. But it's really, and this is what bugs me a lot, because I think that can't be it. Sort of, we have some kind of a responsibility as thinkers and builders and makers and designers and teachers and collaborators, that we have to build things that counter the counter culture. I call it countercultural techniques. So Sebastian Kurz, this is in, I think, 2019, when Peter Thiel got married in Vienna at the Palais Liechtenstein, invited by Sebastian Kurz. Sebastian Kurz just recently founded a new company called Dream Security, together with Shalef Julio, who's one of the founders of the NSO Group, which is the biggest sort of cybersecurity sort of public-private arm of the Mossad, you could say. in Israel, who make a lot of like the world-leading spyware manufacturer besides Palantir and Clearview maybe. I won't show it to you, but I suggest you go on YouTube and watch. If you search for it on YouTube, you will find a video where Sebastian Kurz is on a video call with his Israeli partners who sit at the border of Gaza with machine guns in their hand, and they are signing the papers for the company. And it's bizarre. It's really bizarre. And the plans that Dream Security have is just the same that Doge is doing in the US. So we would be stupid to think that just because we're in Europe, this is not happening here too. So because we have this arrogance, we have this sort of still have this distance that we try to put between us and the US or between us and China, and say just because we're Europeans, we are somehow, well, you know, more enlightened, mehr aufgeklärt als die. But the Dark Enlightenment will come and get you. This is sort of all the, it's interesting because there's a new term recently making the rounds, which for people like me who grew up in the 90s still means something like this. Anyone know what model collapse means? It has nothing to do with Kate Moss. So model collapse is the idea that if you have enough AI models that are trained by other AI models, that are trained by other AI models, they will at some point become useless and collapse. So they are inbreeding, literally. You will find this as a very day-to-day problem today already on academic preprint servers, that you have academic papers which quote, you know, completely AI-generated papers, that again quote completely AI-generated papers, which of course is a huge problem for academic integrity. But if you think about it, these models and these machine learning systems are also being used to substitute governments, or at least parts of government, but this is something that will only subsequently become more and more and more. Of course, then instead of the Dark Enlightenment, we will inevitably end up in the Dork Enlightenment. And with this, I thank you for your attention and hope we have a nice discussion.
Any questions? Who wants to start? Willst du?
Thank you, Paul. You mentioned the term counterculture quite some time, and you also said that at some point hippies became professors or something like this, so counterculture became culture. And is it not true that if the Dark Enlightenment was at some point a counterculture, now it seems to be the mainstream culture and it's not a counterculture anymore?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It has become generally adopted. At the moment it is, well, I think it's an interesting point of discussion we could have, whether something can only be counterculture if it never becomes truly established or accepted. But yeah.
It's scary. I mean.
Yeah, it's scary. So we need another counterculture, a counterculture.
Okay, then I go on.
And at some point it seems that it's not totally new, because we had ideas like fascism for hundreds of years, and it's some kind of racism and fascism all over again.
It's an iteration, although I would argue it is not the same like in the 1930s. However you want to look at it, you could even say it's worse now, you know, what we might be looking at in the future, because the fascists of the 1930s and 1940s didn't have some of the tools that we have now, which, as we know, bear a lot of beautiful potential, but this potential can also be used for violence, warfare, segregation, discrimination, destruction.
What annoys me so much with this whole sphere, what is happening around us right now, is that all the variables seem to be flipped upside down. It's like, for instance, like a stupid example is probably being red-pilled. Like I grew up with the Matrix. I thought I understood the storyline, and I think it's pretty clear what they're talking about. And nowadays, you kind of have reappropriation of concepts, and so it's hard to even argue about certain issues. Like there's nothing to.
Well, but that's the thing, that I think it's because we are fixated. I talk about us as sort of. I assume you are good guys. So the thing is that we are sort of fixated on things working the right way. I think what we see in the Dark Enlightenment is the doing away of sense and meaning. You know, it's really the idea that you find in the Principia Discordia, and that you find also in the idea of memes, is that that meaning is completely fictional. You can just play it around like you want. You can be an FPÖ politician and call other people anti-Semite. So all of these value systems are very easily destroyed if you just stop caring about it, and I think that's what happens. So the large part of right-wing ideology, and this goes from sort of what's now center politics, you know, what Sebastian Kurz has put into the middle of society, which a couple of years ago was right-wing, you know, is now just normal conservative politics, to the very, very far end of the right-wing spectrum of violent neo-Nazis, is that they are very inclusive. That's interesting. I think what we see is that we have two different movements, and we have on one side, and I try to avoid the term because it is so loaded already, but we have a very woke left-wing culture that is very much concerned with definitions, with being very correct, very precise in their way of dealing with reality and dealing with ideologies and with people and individuals and communities, but is completely preoccupied with that. So this has become sort of a hermetic discourse, almost esoteric, you could say. And on the other hand, you have a right-wing movement, which is saying, well, if you just think that gays are bad, you're one of us. But if you think Jews should be exterminated, you're also one of us. So this is really very open-minded, you could say. And also, really, they don't care, you know. This is sort of, it's a form of brutalist power that says, just come, like we're just gonna destroy everything.
And I would like to add one more thing. It's the big problem I see is also it's a hard way to come out. I think it's slippery slope. Like as soon as you agree to these terms, it's really hard to come from the alt-right back to a more woke-minded situation. However, from being on the other side, it's really easy to jump in. So it's like a sect. I think once I read an article where it was about being a sect. The problem about being a sect that you have to accept that you're wrong.
I think it's, I mean, I always like to compare technologies, especially social media, but you could extend it to any form of technology or the way that they are designed today with drugs. So really well made, very well engineered, completely sort of designed towards making you addicted. And preoccupying your mind in a certain way that is just sort of oriented towards the next fix. And I think this works the same way. So there are drugs that you could use that will require your engagement, you know, because they will really do something interesting with your mind, or they will, you know, also really do something nice in terms of creating connection or beautiful sex or whatever, if you just use it as a metaphor. And there are drugs that just fuck you up and make you very addicted. And the right-wing movement and technology is the fentanyl of our time. You know, TikTok is China's revenge for opium. But it is like that, so it's tempting, sort of, you know, once you start with it, you can, it's hard to lose track, and that people get dragged in like this. And it's not a surprise, and it's or not a coincidence that the platforms are being used to recruit. And this could be for Islamic fanaticism, but also for right-wing politics. Whereas, I mean, I've never sort of been drawn into a right-wing bubble on any of the platforms. I'm just in the left-wing ones. And they are sort of very self-destructive in a way. You really can see that they are, it's really just people in sort of outraging each other, you know, which I find a pity, because it's energy that's wasted in an infight.
But might it be due to a lack of education? I mean, it's fine. I can talk. Because like the lobotomy, or what did you call it, the optimal brain damage?
Lobotomy is a good point also, yeah.
It's a good one. Makes me think, because we just did a workshop in a middle school. We're talking teenagers. And we printed messages, and it was all about, you know, you can, utopia, you can really dream big, and future thoughts. And we really were confronted with right-wing fascist quotes in a school that had 11 nations. And we were shocked, you know. It was
And why do you think that is? What's your hypothesis?
They have no clue. It's just something.
But they seem to have one clue. But where do they have it from?
Because they saw it somewhere. But
Yeah,
they
exactly.
they don't understand what it means. Because when
Yeah.
we confronted the kid, he was like, "What?"
Yeah, of course. I had a similar experience. My son is 12, and I gave a workshop in his class, so zweites Gymnasium. It was called Artificial Intelligence, Is It Going to Kill Us or Maybe Not? And it was interesting to see, because I had the opposite impression, actually. I talked with them a lot about sort of the ethics of AI, the question, what is intelligence? Who is intelligent? What is sort of, can you measure intelligence? And then we talked about humanoid robots, and I showed them this fake video of sort of one of the Boston Dynamics robots who's being abused. You might have seen it. So it's this Atlas robot who's used to put packages on shelves, and the trainers attack it with bats and guns, and at some point he fights back. And so I asked them and said, well, do you think it's okay for him to fight back? I also asked him, do you think there was a human inside the machine, or is it AI generated, or is it CGI? And the opinions were quite diverse. But when it came to the ethics of AI and robotics, of the way that we should address technologies and behave with technologies, I have to say their responses were pretty on par with what I would expect you to say.
But the difference being that they were in the gymnasium, and this was Mittelschule. And we actually spoke with the director of the school, and he was like, "What? That's totally normal. They're on the right side, but they'll go their way." I was like, "What?"
I mean, you're absolutely
Unbelievable,
right.
yeah.
Education is,
And that's where it starts, you know.
of course. I mean, this is a huge problem, both on sort of on a political and ideological and cultural level, but also on a technological one. The education system is very much at risk here, and yeah, yes, I can only say yes. It's a very deeply rooted problem.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really fantastic. I was thinking about, because part of my artistic practice is kind of investigating the public speaking of politicians. And I come from Eastern Europe, so we don't have that many professional politicians, you see. They rise very quickly and they fall very quickly. So what is interesting, what I find out is one possibility is like this goal, and I'm talking about 30 years of research, so it's really spanning from 1990 until 2021. That I think that the main goal somehow, it feels to me, is profanization of public speaking, profanization of politics. It's to discredit the discourse at the very, very fundament. And from then on, you can build very easily whatever you want, because at the end of the day, whatever technology we use, it's the primary propaganda weapon. I mean, regardless of the goal, which are communicated from far left to far right, what you mentioned before. So in that sense, I was thinking if you move the discourse from the perspective of, let's say, artists who are engaged in this discourse, socio-political, there you don't find political correctness. Otherwise, I mean, this hardly can be called art, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. So what do you think, for instance, this community in contemporary art could somehow add or somehow change or contribute to this phenomenon that I think it's kind of irreversible at that point, and perhaps it's just how the things will unfold. Maybe we are already too far in this process, but somehow making people aware of the, I don't know, of the results of this, the impact of this might be important. Maybe then it's a matter of communication, right, and participation also, and different dynamics that perhaps maybe we can find in art as well, like in art practices. Thanks.
Thanks. It's a really interesting question. So when I started teaching, that was around 2010, which is pretty much when this artwork was being made, and I really found it interesting and quite positive that the people from the art world, artists but also curators and sort of para-academic theoreticians, were very, very agile in terms of theory adaptation. Whereas I came from sort of classical academia, even though cultural studies in the 90s and early 2000s in Berlin was already sort of, you know, very dynamic, punky thing, but compared to this, we were very old-fashioned. So it was very good for me to see that if you had any sort of, you know, new theory or something that you found exotic or so, you could just throw it to the artists and they would very quickly adapt to it without the pomp and circumstance of academic procedure, you know, because that always also, that's something that troubles me until today, that we have this latency between theory and practice. Especially for me, coming from media theory, I'm very sick of, on one hand, sort of seeing where it's going, on the other hand, only being able in hindsight to critically analyze it somehow, because we lack the structures for collaboration, even though that's slowly changing, fortunately. But you could also see that even if you can throw them a very interesting theory, but you can also throw them right-wing theory and they will just go for it, you know? So what you had in this very prominent movement of post-internet art, which was sort of the new wave of media art in the 2010s, was that many of them fell victim to Dork Enlightenment and to really sort of neo-reactionary ideas and eugenicist ideas and stuff like this. And they were red-pilled, as you say. Also because, of course, they lacked the proper academic, philosophical, historical training for it. So, on the other hand, what I see right now, especially when it comes to machine learning, there are at least a handful of people who do profound critical work, who not only show what the sort of critical limitations of certain mechanisms and systems are, but who actively engage in the design of such systems. So you have public diffusion, which is a new model that's being released by Holly Hunt and Matt Dryhurst, who have been working in fields like this for a long time. They are very engaged in thinking about, you know, the copyright issues, intellectual property, but also artistic freedom, and are trying to also extend their reach into the realms of policy making. And so I think that it's a tricky question. You can say we're too far along, but I would argue that this is not an argument to stop trying.
We have time for one more question.
Also, I have to pee.
Thank you for the nice talking. I just have a question. I realize by using artificial intelligence prompts and so that it's very important how you use the language. So the use of language creates things now, it's the possibility of that. Is that it could be a strategy to pick the right words to pass better messages to combat this kind of like contra system, as you said?
I don't think so, honestly, because the models don't have a concept of what language is. You know, it's really just statistics in a way. So this is not, it's not semantics in a way. This is really just probability. It's interesting though to note that you have a person like Elon Musk going in the media and saying empathy is a disease. And Sam Altman coming along and saying, please stop saying please to ChatGPT because it's using too much energy. So this is, of course, also training a whole society on a certain kind of language. So I think the training works the other way around, unfortunately. So it really goes back to the very core idea of media theory, which is really very simply put by Nietzsche, saying, das Schreibzeug schreibt mit an unseren Gedanken, so the writing instruments are writing our thoughts, not we are. And we shouldn't forget that, actually, even though we have built machines that at least create the illusion of somehow being on par with us.
I would like to end with one little short question, and it's and I think from what I see, what I hear when I listen to all this new movements going on, is this extreme yearning for simplicity.
I was just about to quote you, actually. Rüdiger said it before we started here. Complex time asks for simple answers. I think they shouldn't. You know, maybe some self-advertisement. We are starting a new study program at Mozarteum called Open Arts, which is designed to be a transdisciplinary program that thinks together and practices together art, technology, and science, and philosophy, and all the other beautiful things. And the underlying idea is that exactly because we live in complex times, we also need complex people and complex skill sets to combine that, and also because complexity requires community. Because, of course, we are not that complex, each and every one of us, but if we work together, we are. Thank you. Also, thanks to Romana, finished today. June 2nd in Museum der Moderne, we are having a public roundtable discussion on similar topics. It's called Totale Technologie, Artificial Intelligence, Social Media and Global Fascism, with the wonderful Hito Steyerl, Felix Stalder, Harald Gritschi, the director of the museum, and me. There will be drinks afterwards, so, and it's free entry, so if that's not an advertisement enough to talk about anti-fascism, I don't know what is.